Welcome to Unspoken, Community and Business Conversations. Today we have with us Dr. Cassi Pittman-Claytor, and we'll be talking about her recent book, Black Privilege. Dr. Cassi Pittman-Claytor specializes in examining the underlying social and cultural processes that affect African Americans' economic behavior. Utilizing qualitative methods, her work has investigated African American experiences in the consumer market as well as the mortgage market. She has published research examining Black consumers' experiences and Black perceptions of social mobility and racial progress. In this book, Black Privilege, she offers original analysis as to what middle class status buys Blacks that have the cultural capital, credentials, and cash on hand. And it documents how middle class Blacks' economic life, economic transactions, and market relations are affected by their race. Dr. Pittman-Claytor, thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday. How are
Thank you for
you?
having us. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Be
Thank
here
you.
virtually.
We are so happy to have you. I have been reading your book and it is absolutely phenomenal. Some of the things you bring up is just so much of the conversations that we need to be having, and offers a very fresh perspective on, I guess you say the privileges, yes, of Blacks. And I mean, I guess I've never even thought about it in that way, as far as, us having a Black privilege. So please tell us, more about what influenced you to write this book. What does Black privilege mean?
So for me, I think part of it is my own personal experience, but also I have to say I was a part of a program in graduate school that examined social inequality. And so a lot of the research that we would read was always focusing on the experiences of poor Blacks. And there was as if there was if there were it was as if there were no other African Americans, like they're just Blacks living in poverty. And I knew from my own experience that wasn't the case. There's working class Blacks, there's middle class Blacks, there's upper class Blacks, there's Blacks who have achieved a great deal. And that was never really conveyed in the research. So, in some sense, I was inspired to write this book to fill that void, to say we need to have a more encompassing view of the Black experience. And of course, a disproportionate number of Blacks live in poverty, but a large fraction of Blacks don't. And
Mm-hmm.
a significant fraction of Blacks are college educated or have some college. And actually, that is the majority. So, why aren't we telling those stories? Why aren't we focusing on the challenges that come once you do have an education, once you are in a prestigious occupation, right? That doesn't mean being Black is any less significant. It doesn't mean that racism goes away. And some would even argue being Black and middle class exposes you to more racism because you're constantly interacting with the white public at work, at school, in
Mm-hmm.
all these
Mm-hmm.
settings, right? And
Yeah.
so I guess I was in part inspired by my own experience, just knowing that there are Black people across the board, and that was not represented in the literature. I was at a top program, and one of the number one programs in the country, if not the world. And so it just seemed like it was desperately needed, a focus on the totality of the Black experience, with a particular focus highlighting the experiences of non-poor Blacks.
And so, specifically, you touched on it already, and that's one of the things that really stood out to me in the beginning of the book, was talking about, we've heard of code switching before, but you offer a unique perception and analysis of that, of how literally it's sort of a survival technique, and not just that, it's even literally, what's the word I'm looking for? It's actually a skill. It's actually a skill
Yeah.
that the Black middle class has had to attain, and just being able to navigate both those worlds. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
So one of the defining features that I argue of the Black middle class experience is the ability to move across social domains. So my work was focused in New York. So I argue, being able to go from the Black Baptist church on Sunday to the white Wall Street firm on Monday, and everywhere in between. So that is a part of the Black middle class experience, and that requires a unique set of cultural skills. It requires cultural flexibility. So I think when we say code switching, that's like our shorthand term. And actually, when you look at the actual use of code switching, it really only refers to linguistic use. So being able to switch linguistic codes or speak different variants of English in different settings. But what I'm referring to is a much larger cultural capacity, a cultural skill set to know how to wear your hair in one setting versus another, or how to talk, how to walk, how to dress, all of that cultural knowledge. When is it okay to talk about your personal experience, and when, if you talk about your personal experience, might it make someone feel uncomfortable and highlight stereotypes that might actually serve to disadvantage you? So really knowing how to gauge, it's like a diplomat. It's like having a capacity to understand different cultures and understand how best to gain acceptance in different cultures. And it doesn't mean compromising who you are. It means being able to successfully navigate settings that other people wouldn't be able to navigate, right? And if more cultures, if more racial groups had the same level of flexible cultural astuteness as middle class Blacks, the world would be a better place, because there would be more empathy, right? There would be more compassion. There would be more ability to put yourself in other people's places, and also an ability to communicate with people who are very different from you. And so I really actually think that's an asset for middle class Blacks. And it takes, they cultivate it over the course of their lifetime. And it's a very useful tool to help them advance, and also to stay on top.
So you mentioned that black middle class people in this sector, that they experience racism even more as consumers than we do in what spaces. Talk to us a little bit more about that. I forget how you worded it, and I don't want to take away from your expertise on that.
Right. So for middle class Blacks, they're often in occupations where there are very few, if any, other Blacks. And so I sent over a chart, and I can pull it up, but it shows, like, in all of these occupations, whether it be attorneys, physicians, architects, veterinarians, less than 1% of all veterinarians in this country are Black. So if you're working in these professional settings, you're more than likely going to be dealing with racism on multiple levels, and also dealing with being a racial token. So that's at work. But then if you think about their experiences in their neighborhood, there's lots of ways. If you live in an integrated neighborhood, or you live in a majority white neighborhood, as a person of color who has a certain level of means, you might also be exposed to racial stereotypes. And so people in my study who lived in white neighborhoods talked about, people assuming they must be a drug dealer, or questioning how it is that they are able to afford to live in the neighborhood, or basically making them feel like they don't belong, even though they have the capacity to buy a home in the area. So their workplace, they deal with it, their neighborhoods, they deal with it. And then I talk about all the public settings, from nightclubs to restaurants to bars, all these other public settings where they also must confront negative views, anti-Black bias, which result in them having less than favorable experiences, despite the fact that they are perfectly capable of affording a luxury experience, or a particular type of leisure or revelry. So in all these different situations, they're dealing with and confronting anti-Black bias, right? But you can imagine a poor or working class Black who, they might not be navigating all those same terrains as frequently, right? But this is a part of the everyday experience, even a part of their educational experience, so every step along the way, every aspect of their throughout their lives, they're having to encounter these spaces where being Black might be seen negatively. and they are having to confront that sort of stereotype.
So this may be kind of going, sidebar from the book, but just kind of in more of a general question. So there seems to be a bit of a divide between the Black community with the more so poor working class that you speak of, with this upper echelon Black middle class. Yet the experiences are all the same. So I guess I'm wondering, do you see any real divide between what this Black middle class goes through and what this poor working class goes through, and why do you think that there is a divide in the Black community between these two classes?
So I find actually that the divide is often, I think, overinflated and overstated, because all of the middle class Blacks, or nearly all of them that I interviewed, they had family members, they had friends, they had people who they went to church with or who they grew up with who were working class or poor. And they didn't have a distaste for them. They loved them. They looked out for them. They wanted them to experience some of the same advantages that they had. They were very collectively oriented. And this extends beyond their family and friends to just the larger Black community. They were very much dedicated to the idea that we as Blacks have to help each other advance. And so I didn't see as much of this tension that people often, sometimes in the Black community, we have a perception that is crabs in the barrel. But in my research, I didn't find that. I found middle class Blacks who maintained and had a lot of connections to Blacks who were of different social economic backgrounds. And they maintained this idea that it's important for Blacks to help each other to get ahead. And this is very different. So I have a chapter and it looks at Blacks aspirational consumption. And if you ask Americans more broadly, they typically are very materialistic in thinking about their consumption fantasies. So they want a luxury car, they want to go on a luxury vacation, they would like to purchase a mansion. If they ever hit the lotto, those are like the most salient responses that people levy. But Black people in my study, when I asked them if they were to hit the lottery or they were to come into, a large sum of money, what would they do with it? They talked about buying a house for their mother, or helping pay off or giving to their churches, or establishing community centers. So that to me does not show a sort of distaste or despisement of the lower class. That shows that we want their boats to go be lifted as well. And another aspect of that, I would say, is they didn't describe their achievement as a result of their own efforts. They often said, I was only able to make it here because other people looked after me, or invested in me, or sacrificed for me. And so that also is a driver of their feeling the need or obligation to give back. So I didn't find as much tension. I mean, there are certainly tensions. So, for example, women would talk about when they would navigate public streets, how men would be on the corner and they would catcall them, or, hey, baby, hey, chocolate, can I get your number, this, that, and the other. And they would say it was like an annoyance. I'm coming home from work and I got to deal with all of this. I don't want to hear all that. Right. But it wasn't like a distaste or, ugh. It was just like, I'm tired from working all day and you're out here catcalling me. It's just like an annoyance. So there were those moments. And I think it's important to realize that they might be, differences in how people carry themselves, or within the Black community. The Black community is very diverse, is very heterogeneous. So there are going to be differences in sort of lifestyle preferences and taste, but that doesn't mean there's this there's this void that can't be crossed, or that there's this divide, or that people don't feel any sense of commonality. In fact, that's not what I found. I found that even the wealthiest of the people I interviewed, felt extremely dedicated to uplifting the Black community. And often, where did they go to church? These are relationships that they maintained, if that makes sense. They maintain relationships that were of importance to them, to people who were across the class spectrum who were also Black.
Okay. And so, out of your research, of all the people that you interviewed, there's definitely a couple that stood out to me. Who would you say stood out to you the most out of your interviews? Who would you say maybe made the biggest impact on you?
I would actually say as a group. So what I would find is, and the book doesn't encompass all of the interviews I did. I did over 85 interviews. And what I would find is people would think their experience was just their experience, but I would hear the same types of stories over and over and over again. So, for example, Black professional women being assumed to be the secretary when they are actually a partner at a firm, or so there are certain recurrent patterns. And so one of the things that struck me was that they just thought that they were the only ones going through these things, and in fact this was a part of the Black middle class experience. And so I hope that through the stories of the people I highlight, I make it clear that this was a larger experience that was beyond their individual circumstances, but is something that the whole kind of group or category often encounter. And that's why it's so important that we highlight that, because it's a part of it's not universal, obviously, but a large number of middle class Blacks are enduring the same types of experiences.
Is there anything that you learned during your research and interviewing that caught you by surprise that you didn't expect?
I was surprised in some respects the extent to which people were still encountering so much racism in various market settings. So, whether it be nightclubs, it was pretty, the extent to which that was still happening was sort of surprising. Not being let in, told that they're full and a group of white patrons are able to get in, or at restaurants really receiving like less than adequate service. Like the extent that that was so salient was a little surprising, because you imagine it's 2021, things have improved, but in fact it's sort of like the same burdens and barriers that our grandparents might have encountered in those types of like public settings.
And so we know that the Black community has a buying power of like what 1.4 trillion. It's just an astronomical number. And so I recall in the book that you several of the interviewees mentioned that they purposely try to patronize Black businesses, and that's extremely important to them. How do we as the Black community hone our buying power? How do we take more control of that, knowing that even with the cash and credentials that we have to spend, that we're still facing these barriers?
So I actually think that's a very difficult question to answer in some respects, because we know the challenges that Black businesses face and Black entrepreneurs face. They have difficulty gaining access to capital. They're much less likely to stay in business. They don't have as many employees, and they're often relegated to certain spheres of the economy. Right. And so that was in some sense. So the people I interviewed, they talked about being ideologically committed to buying Black. But then when I asked them, like, in what instances do you actually support Black owned businesses, it was like very limited, because there were very few Black businesses they felt they could support on a routine basis. So what were those businesses? It's like restaurants, beauty shops, barbershops. It was a very limited, maybe a few clothing boutiques, right? So it was limited, in at the same time they have this like desire to support it. They are committed to supporting it, but at the same time, they often felt, I mean, it was in some sense they're constrained. And that's the constraint, is because a lot of Black owned businesses are limited in their ability to succeed due to challenges that, other businesses don't face. There's a really interesting study that this young scholar is doing about Black startups in Silicon Valley. And what she found is like they just have such a difficult time getting access to capital that they basically have to either work full time and try to support their startup, or they have to seek out alternative means of capital. right? And so one example she used was drawing on Black athletes as potential funders, as potential investors in their ventures because they weren't getting access to the venture capital. And so I think that might also be, I mean, thinking about solutions, that might be a solution. Like, how do we, as a Black community, how do we levy our collective wealth to help to reinvest in entrepreneurs and provide capital? Because we know, banks discriminate. The private equity firms and the venture capitalists are not willing to invest often in Black inventors, entrepreneurs, and startups. So, I do think there is a large capacity for collective wealth to be utilized to help advance that. And one example, what is collective wealth? So, you can think about all the churches and all the deposits that they get, and utilizing those monies to reinvest in the communities in ways that reproduce the benefit. So not just investing in social services, but investing in jobs through entrepreneurs who are able to create businesses that will produce jobs, if that makes sense.
And so you touched on and you said something that's really profound that I want to come back to about how, unfortunately, a lot of the interviewees that they want to support more Black owned businesses and want to patronize more Black owned businesses, but are limited. And one of the charts that you sent that we're absolutely going to show talks about the lack of Blacks that are in prestigious careers. I'm just amazed at this chart, the difference. And so, I mean, my question is like, how do we encourage more of the Black community to get into these career fields? Like how, I mean, don't get me wrong. We appreciate, of course, the people who are starting the salons and the barbershops and the restaurants, but how do we break into some of these more prestigious careers that we're clearly just totally lacking in, as far as, the architects, the counters, the dentists, the lawyers? How do we get more of the Black community into these fields?
So, I work at Case, and Case as a university has very few Black students. So, I mean, one of the things we have to, in some way, prepare our students better so that they're college ready and that they can compete in colleges, and also make sure that colleges are more equitable. So, Cleveland is a majority Black city. So why does the university have, like, I think it's something like 5% Black students? It's not at all representative of the Cleveland population. So maybe we need to put more pressure on institutions like Case to be more equitable, to make investments, to create pipelines, so to ensure that there can be more Black engineers and dentists. Case is exceptional at educating students and preparing them for medical school. And we know that Black doctors often provide better care for Black patients, right? And when there's a same race effect where Black patients often receive not as good of quality care when the doctor doesn't understand them. So we desperately need more Black physicians, and Case is exceptional at educating students and preparing them for medical school, but we don't have that many Black students. So, I really think it's a deep-seated issue. I think often in the Black community, we think, oh, well, what is it that we can do individually? But I really think it's a structural problem. And all of the research indicates that oftentimes Black people care more about education than whites, and Black students care more about education than whites, but they face inequities in the education system that are difficult to overcome. So, how do we change the structure of our education system so it's more equitable? How do we make sure that colleges and universities are investing in pipeline programs to ensure that students of color, Black students specifically, have equitable access? I think those are such key things. But certainly the benefits of having a college education, having a college education over the course of your life, you're more than likely to earn $40,000 more annually than someone who doesn't have a college education. There's so many benefits. So how do we increase the number? If we increase the number, I think, of blacks and the numbers are going up. So I should say that in terms to be optimistic, far more blacks are getting college educations today than they were in 1970, and far more blacks were getting educations in 1970 that were in 1940. So it has been huge progress, but we still have a lot of ways to go. And also, we need to start holding these institutions more accountable. So I think that that's so critical.
Yes, absolutely critical. And so I'm glad you touched on that as well. I mean, across the board, I just want to reiterate that we have to start holding not only the institutions, but these organizations in general accountable. Obviously, in the wake of George Floyd, we've seen a lot of organizations and institutions say that they want to be more active and more involved with being inclusive and making sure that things are diverse. And so now is the time more than ever that, leaders in our community have to start holding these organizations and institutions to those promises. So my last and final question for you, Cassie, is this again is such a phenomenal book. I want to have you back on in another way at some point to talk even more about this. But to conclude our interview for today, what is one or two things that you hope the readers get when they read this book?
So I think that I hope that they get a sense of the Black experience that's not riddled with sort of disadvantage in a way. So thinking about the idea that Black people have aspirations, that they have hobbies and things that they like to enjoy, that they have dreams, and that they have ideas about how the world should be and how the world could be more equitable and how Black people could be as a race advance. So it's, I think, important to highlight that there's Black joy. It's not just all Black people being oppressed, but at the same time realizing that a lot of the American kind of model is like, oh, just if you work hard and you're educated and you do these three things, then you can live the American dream. And I think that part of my goal is also to show, hey, these people have elite credentials. They're working in these prestigious occupations. They have high incomes with money to spend, but that doesn't buffer them from racism. And so when we think about how racism operates, we have to really think deeply about it, not as a function of some deficit that Black people have, but as a way in which our entire society is structured, and is structured in a way to sort of limit opportunities for Blacks. So even though we are facing these barriers and we're still striving, I have a chapter, it's called Striving and Surviving. It's like we're still striving despite the fact we have to overcome these obstacles. And I think that's a testament to our resilience as a people. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that the system is rigged against us. And no matter how individually meritocracy, like no matter what you have achieved, you still are going to have to face this system. Your children are, you know, and so we have to still be committed to and also highlight the ways in which the system needs to change.
So, Cassie, please tell our viewers, where can they find your book?
So it's available anywhere books are sold. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and I've been trying to work with a local Black-owned bookseller to make sure that she has it available. But once I'm able to sort of know specifically if she'll have it available, I would like to direct people there. But it's also just available. It's available, wherever books are sold. You can also buy it from the press. It's a book that was published by Stanford University Press. So if you go to their website, you can get the book as well.
Okay, and I think you mentioned that you have a promo code. Would you like to share?
I believe the promo code, and maybe we can make sure that this goes in the highlights. It's I believe it's Pittman 20 or Pittman-Claytor 20, but I have to get it for you. I have to get it for you, Shar,
Okay,
so it's
no problem. We'll
specific.
be sure to share that. Okay, well, thank you again so much for your time today. To our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this. I strongly encourage you to go out and read this book. It's absolutely a fresh perspective. Personally, I can say that, again, navigating both these worlds is really daunting sometimes. And the idea of code switching is often viewed as negative. And so the book was extremely refreshing for me, just in the sense of it was indeed the first time that I looked at those skill sets as a privilege, as Black privilege, and just knowing how we can navigate both worlds. And so again, I strongly encourage you all to purchase the book. It is called Black Privilege, Modern Middle Class Blacks with Credentials and Cash to Spend. It's a long title and I don't even remember, but we will share the book. Again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Cassi, again for joining us, and you all have a great weekend.
Such a pleasure.
Absolutely.
All right, lovely. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you guys for tuning in. This is Unspoken.